Welcome to another optional video from Module 215. And in truth, this should probably not be an optional video because we're going to be discussing one of the most important ingredients. We talk a lot about assessment. We talk a lot about the behavioral management strategies that we use both in a programmed format and in a pervasive format. But there's a third part that's equally important, and if it isn't done right, nothing else matters, and that's implementation. And that's what this video is all about, the things that we should think about when we're doing implementation. It's a classic mistake to think that this is the work of a supervisor, but really, while it is a big part of a supervisor's job, you will not be successful if the supervisor is the only one who cares about these things. And B, if you ever want to be a supervisor, you'll be able to show that you have supervisory and leadership skills by really thinking about and addressing some of these considerations. So the first one is the involvement of the supported person in the whole implementation process. What this does is not only help us to have something that's more socially valid and feels good, but really genuinely makes a big difference in terms of the outcome of any programming or interventions we do. Because plain and simple, the individual has more motivation. They own the process more as a stakeholder, and therefore they become more committed in it. And it's really important, if we're going to fade ourselves out of the picture to some extent over time, that we really give people at least some intervention, some control, I should say, from the very beginning. It should always be meaningful and not just symbolic. Having people in the room while you're doing the planning or implementation is not the same thing. It's actually giving people some of the responsibilities. I'll give you a simple example. Let's say a person is rewarded with candies for their program. Well, going with them, having them come with you to the store to buy them and choose the ones that they want is really important. It can build excitement for the program. It can make sure that you have the right kind of candies, and they can literally have this kind of concrete interaction with the reward and sort of get excited about it. That's just one little way that you can have that person involved in designing the program. And the whole idea is to gradually escalate that involvement as the person becomes more and more capable, more and more interested, and frankly, as you become more and more creative. There's really no limit to how much you can get the person to play a role in making their program successful. It also means getting that person involved in the evaluation of it. So the person is really going to make sure that you want to have that person's their involvement evaluated. That means you're going to go back and ask them repeatedly, have you been involved in a way that's meaningful? Can we think of other ways together? And also asking the person questions about whether the program is working and what they like about it, what they don't like about it. I've been in circumstances before where an exceptional program was designed, but the individual just kind of plateaued after a while. And the reason was they simply got bored of it. And if we'd done some assessment by asking them what they thought about it, we probably could have done something earlier on so that that program didn't just lose all of its steam and therefore become a waste of time. So getting that person involved isn't just nice, but critical. It's also really important to think about the staff development, all the things that need to be done. For example, when you introduce a program, you need to do some training. You need to orient people to the program itself, and you might need to go into describing some of the principles behind it. We spent a lot of time in our course talking about this stuff, but a lot of other people go to courses that don't. And even if they have, they might not use these skills for years, and sometimes they fade from their memory. Even after we've implemented the program, it's a really good idea for us to go back and refresh ourselves on the strategies and refresh ourselves on the principles. I often see people, very, very good people, start to kind of get in bad habits. They don't even notice that they've changed something a little bit in terms of its timing or the script that they use or the reward that they use. And what can sometimes happen is that new people, rather than reading the program or learning it, come in and just watch what the more experienced people do, and it kind of becomes more and more eroded. So it's really a good idea to go back periodically, talk about it at a staff meeting, practice the procedures on each other, and actually talk about any questions or areas where people have started to blur the lines. When you're involved in recruiting, and you may have an opportunity to do this, being part of looking at resumes or interviewing people, one of the things you want to look at is whether they have really valuable experience in this area. You can see whether they've been trained by somebody else and whether they possess certificates, like, for example, in nonviolent positive behavioral intervention strategies, or ABA. And you can see whether or not they've worked in organizations that you might know don't always have a lot of rigor. You want to make sure that staff people are being evaluated routinely. And even if you're not a supervisor, you can help this by actually asking to be evaluated. You might seem crazy to ask that, but when you ask to be evaluated, it really amps up the professionalism for you, and it also creates a bit more of a culture where that becomes normal. All those evaluations will be critical for you later on if you go looking for a promotion or you leave the organization and go elsewhere, because now there's a written record of your performance. So even if your supervisor leaves, you've got them. And as I said, in the short term, by asking for evaluations to take place, it kind of makes everybody have to perform at a higher level. And if somebody isn't, then they can normally have targeted performance improvements. And staff development also includes emotional support. This work of dealing with challenging behavior can take its toll on us emotionally. And so good organizations do both formal and informal things to help staff cope with them. They might have debriefing. They might have staff get-togethers. They might have people connected with what they call the EAP, the Employer Assistance Program, which usually means they have access to counseling. And they just check in on each other and tag team throughout their shifts so that we're all kind of being supportive to each other. All of these things really matter. Another thing to think about is how we involve other stakeholders. One of the big questions is what to do with the non-professionals around the table. And different organizations have different answers for this question of whether families should be involved in doing programming. In my experience, families can be involved in some of the more basic things, but when a program becomes very precise or very sophisticated, it is neither very effective nor very fair to ask families to do it. Families don't typically work this way where they're incredibly mechanical and precise. Instead, families often function through affection, forgiveness, spending time together, coaching, and that's what works for them. And we want to be complementary to that, meaning we want to work along with that, not try to replace that. All of that affection and love is part of what people need. And asking families to be really careful about precise procedures and date recording is something that's not very likely to work in many cases. And if people don't do it, there's almost no mechanism for somebody to come in and correct it. Supervisors don't have authority to sit down and retrain or evaluate the family's approach. So usually it's better for just staff to do these. It is often a good idea for multiple programs to work together, a day program and a residence, for example. But let families just be families and sit and talk with them about how they can be supportive in other ways without actually being involved in the delivery. So for example, they can simply ask their child when the child comes home, how are you doing? Or look in their communication book and see whether they made progress. If a child gets a reward such as a ribbon, they can display the ribbon on the board and make a big deal of it at their home. If the child or an adult is getting to go out for a meal, maybe being able to invite mom along is something that adds even more value to that reinforcer. The more that we can get families just to sort of morally and socially support what we're doing, the better off the student or the individual we're supporting will do. They don't need to be professional in their execution. When we're dealing with other professionals, it's really important for us to all define what we're responsible for and what we're not. So for example, as I've mentioned, a day program in a group home might do very similar things. But I remember developing a program years ago with an individual who had a very limited range of reinforcers that they liked. So we had to agree who was going to use one of the two and who was going to use the other one so that we didn't satiate the person. And we were quite happy to work that out. It's also important to recognize simple things like who's going to buy the supplies and who's going to keep the records. But what about if you're dealing with professionals who aren't CSWs or other EAs? In that case, you might need to have clarity around what the other people are supposed to do. For example, are they the program designer, like a behavioral consultant? Or are they just a resource person that you would call and ask for input from? Maybe they have a specific expertise, such as medical expertise, and they fit into the program by delivering that. An example might be an occupational therapist. When you do that, when you're defining the roles of those other people, you don't try to say what they're going to do. You simply write into the provisions of the program that the person's going to go to their occupational therapist every Tuesday afternoon. And then you say something to the effect of, well, whatever the occupational therapist gives us to do for homework will be added to the program, if it's stretching or dietary things, for example. We want to avoid duplications. Don't give two people or more, the same job. When it comes to doing things like administering all of the different program things, that's great. but you don't need two people to be responsible for doing all the data collation, for example. And what happens is sort of like when people are about to go catch a baseball and everybody else thinks somebody else is catching it, nobody ends up catching it, or they crash into each other. So make sure you're clear about who's doing what. And if people really care about doing something, unless you have some real serious concerns about their credibility or their competency, let them do it. Don't get into turf wars. Typically, people are given far more praise for working together than they are for doing things on their own or proving how smart they are. Staging and timing is one of the most important things. In other words, thinking about the order of activities. When do certain parts of the program begin? When do certain professionals get started or certain resources get brought into the scene? One of the things we ask is what has to happen first? Or in other words, what's a prerequisite? So for example, do we have to work on somebody's fitness before we can start working on somebody getting out and doing some exercise in the community? Maybe we have to do some basic fitness at home. And that's just one example. We'll also need to estimate how much time will be needed for various stages of things. And it's always best to overestimate, and we call that being conservative, giving yourself plenty of time. The next thing is to think about staff time and priorities. Don't ask people to do everything all at once. You have to think about what else they're doing and how they can gradually ramp up to something, whether or not something might need to be delayed a bit just for the simple reason that staff couldn't do it well if they try to tackle it now. The same is true of other professionals and resources. It's very common for people to be on wait lists for things like therapeutic programs, riding programs, or therapeutic camps. So you can't just guarantee that they're going to be there at the exact moment that you need them, and it pays to do some research and work from those timelines backwards. And build in time for unexpected events. Be ready to be flexible. It's very likely that your plan will be having to be changed along the way. Don't forget to think about equipment and other resources such as access to community-based programs or media. For example, if you need a particular game or video game, make sure it's available and don't go ahead until you know you've got something that fills that need. Same with courses run at the local college or community center. Make sure the funding source is actually there. The funding source might be something as simple as a budgetary line that allows you to go out and spend $500 a year on rewards. Make sure it's still there. Make sure it hasn't been spent. That's a simple conversation usually with the administrator at your front office or through your supervisor. And make sure that what you're doing is socially valid, that the community is not going to get up in arms when you do it. Think about whether other staff will feel comfortable doing it and whether or not you have approval as necessary. For sure, you're going to need approval from your superior. You're going to need approval from the caregivers, from the guardians of people if they're under 19, and from the person themselves if they're over 19. And sometimes you need approval from licensing officers, social workers, and other doctors and other medical professionals, but your supervisor should be able to guide you on that. Make sure you have an ample supply of rewards. It's very simple to see a program fall apart just because somebody forgot to go out and buy the candies or buy the little treasures that are supposed to be the rewards. And all that happens is you work so hard to get a person to earn the reward, you go into the cupboard to get it, and there's nothing there. And now they have a meltdown. They lose their cool. So it's such a simple thing to make sure that you have everything and that you know where it's kept. Proper storage so that people can't go into the cupboard and take all the candy and now you wonder why the candy isn't working, or not having the key to go in there because you didn't ask for where it was. These are simple things. And other resources such as recording sheets, or where is the program going to be kept so that you can open it up and read it. If there are phone numbers or bus routes or that sort of thing, are they clearly listed? Can you quickly realize when it says that the person's supposed to go out for lunch, where do they go? What money are they supposed to use? These are logistical things that seem small and petty, but when you realize on a Saturday afternoon that you can't go and deliver the reward, suddenly they become a lot bigger. I don't know why this particular slide is so small, but it's another important implementation consideration of record keeping and review. As this program is going, you should be collecting data, and you want to make sure that you get the data that you really need so that later on you can see whether your program is working. But you don't ask staff to go and record the same thing 2 or 3 or 4 different ways, just wasting your time. Why? Because people will stop recording and then you'll have no data. So it's an interesting dynamic. When you ask for more, sometimes you get less. So make sure that you get just the right amount. And train staff so they know why it matters and how to do it correctly. There's a metaphor, the oil drop phenomenon. If you take a gallon of water and you put one drop of oil in it, you spoil all of the water. And data works the same way. If everybody on the team is taking data correctly, except for one person, that one person's inaccurate data will make everybody else's work completely useless. You can't go back later on and just sort of decide what data you like and what data you don't like. So it's really important at the beginning for people to understand the importance of collecting data precisely, consistently, and understanding how to do that. And make sure people know that you don't guess at things. Have a conversation about what to do when there are gaps. For example, if a person goes away for the weekend, now what do we do? There's no data to be collected. How do we note that on the forms? Such a simple thing. And what if a person was sick on a given day, and that might explain why their behavior was different? Maybe there's a place on the data form for us to make notes. Something we might consider doing in writing it right into the program is that we're going to use something called smoothing. And what this means is that when we sit down to collect the data, to analyze the data, we might remove the 1 or 2 best days and the 1 or 2 worst days so that we haven't got data that really skews things. If a person was really sick one day, it might change their rate of behavior dramatically and make it look like our program didn't work. But the same is also true if we went to the P&E one day and the person was in a wonderful mood and everything went smoothly. So we have to kind of think about removing the highs and the lows that are outliers, in other words, that aren't typical. Then one of the most important things we do is we don't remove just one side. So if you're going to take out one negative, you also have to take out one positive outlier. And if you do 2, then you should take out 2. Now, you don't always have to do this, but if you decide to do it, then you always have to do it. You can't say, oh, this time I'm not going to do it. So if you're going to do it on a program, you always have to do the same way of measuring the data, same way of looking or collating the data, in other words, collecting it and adding it all up. And if you don't do it consistently, then it'll look different from one time to the next. It would be like measuring in inches one time and in centimeters the next time. The data would be confusing. When you analyze the data, it's always important to go back and think about what the person's goals were. And goals, as we've talked about before, should be SMART plus. The M, as you recall, is the measurability part. Should be a number in there. So now we can later on and go back and say if we're shooting for something to happen for a particular frequency or a particular duration, now we can measure whether we're getting closer or further away from that. We should have a specific written review plan, and this should be embedded right into our program. And I'll show you a little bit about that on the next slide. You should get help if you don't know what you're doing when it comes to collating data. It's totally acceptable to say, listen, is there somebody on my team who's better at understanding math? Is there somebody in our organization that can help us to make meaning out of these data points? Don't just assume. I've seen this all the time where people look at it and say, well, I think it looks good. And then when you ask them why, they can't really tell you. What they're really telling you is they want it to look good. They want it to feel like they've been successful. But it can be a simple matter of sending something by email to somebody in your organization who has done some training in this area, and they can quickly be able to tell you. Your review period should also be thought out. And typically what we do is we pick a 2-week data period after we've started a program with a specific intention of just talking with the supported person and the other people who are helping to implement the program and just find out if there's any implementation issues. Are they too busy? Are the instructions unclear? Has the person shown that they're not interested, or that sort of thing? And then what we're going to do after that is we're going to divide up our program period into quarters. And every quarter we're hoping that person to be a quarter further towards their goal. So if we wanted somebody to be able to sink 100 baskets in 12 months, then we would expect them to be able to sink 50 in 6 months, 25 in 3 months, 75 in 9 months. So that's kind of how we do it. And if you're not sure how to do that, again, it's totally okay to ask for help. But basically all we're doing is we're looking at the big goal and then dividing it into mini goals. And these are called indicators. So I said you would need to include a review, a plan, and this is the review plan. And this is the last part of this video. But this is written right into your document, and it usually has the heading review plan. And you can literally say any of the emboldened parts here as headings or subheadings in it. So first, when are we going to evaluate, or what dates? And you'll notice I specified dates. I don't want you to say we're going to do it in 2 weeks, because if you pick up the program and you don't know what date it was started on, then 2 weeks is meaningless. So you literally write into a calendar what dates you're going to be doing this. Have your iPhone ding when it's time to go and look at the data. 2 weeks in every quarter, as we said, are usual measurements. And remember, the fourth quarter is the same. The last date is the same as the fourth quarter. In other words, if we have a year-long date, the last evaluation is that year. Question number 2 is what sources of data? What we mean by a data source is where will we find the information that we're looking for? Not yet what is the information that we're looking for, just where will we find it? For example, are we going to interview staff and ask them how things are going? Interview the subject or interview family members? Are we going to collect data sheets? And many times when you're writing programs, you have a specific data sheet that you keep that shows how many tickets a person has got, or how many times they raised their hand that day, or how many times they were in the bathroom, or how long they did something before they did something else. So that recording sheet's very valuable. And in fact, you often would not only tell people to use the data sheet, but you'd describe how, and you'd even attach a form that you've created so that people can clearly see how to do it. A really good practice is to put a fictitious example in so that people can see what it should look like. But you could also count other things. For example, if your challenging behavior is that a person strikes out at others, then you might look at the number of incident reports that they're putting in, that are being submitted for them. If that goes down, that's a pretty good piece of evidence. And you can look at other records that are almost always done and can sometimes have multiple purposes. For example, if you're looking at somebody's daily records, you might see whether or not the person went out and did more social activities by counting their daily log. You might take a look at the person's sleep record to see whether or not they're sleeping better at night as an indicator of whether or not the person's going to bed on time. And on we may go. But you're going to identify the data sources that give you the best information. And again, you're not going to ask staff people to collect data in 3 or 4 different places when they're just writing the same thing down. Make sure you don't overburden them. And what indicators? Now, what are you looking for? These can usually be quantitative and qualitative. For example, we want to see that a person's behavior is improving by looking at the number. That's quantitative. But also we want to see things like, does the person say they enjoy the program? Does the person say that their life has improved? Does the person seem to be smiling more often? And what do other stakeholders have to say? And finally, question number 4. And literally you're going to describe what you think might need to happen. I don't have a more technical way of explaining this to you except to say that when you write a program, you'll gain a sense of where you had to kind of do some guessing or estimating. For example, you might not know for sure that the reinforcer will be something that will have lasting value. You might not have a strong sense of how fast this person's transformation will happen. You might not know exactly when you should stage another part of the program to begin. So what you can simply put here is what you'll likely do based on the results. So for example, you might say, if we aren't achieving our milestones, for example, 50% of the progress by 50% of the time, we're going to extend the date. Or maybe we're going to say, if we start to notice that the behavior slows down in its improvement, we'll change the reward. And if we can see that the behavior is accelerating or getting close to the end, we might begin doing a fading strategy where we begin to remove some of the rewards. We'll talk about fading in a little bit here in another video. Maybe we might say it's time to introduce step 2, whatever that is. Maybe it's the dates that he begins going to a particular sex education course or begins to participate in a cooking class. And we might even decide to do something called resolution, simply meaning we consider the program to be completed. And in the next optional video, we're going to talk about what we do at resolution. There are a few different options there. Okay, hopefully this has been helpful to you. And even though it's not necessarily required content for the course, it's definitely required content for real life.